Broadcast of the Beyond Secret Texas broadcast. To you from the third coast, the coast of the most, the Gulf Coast of Texas, my pride and privilege to do so. So thank you, each and every one of you. I want to jump into it quickly, bring you up to speed. This is the fourth installment, part 4 of the Tex Saga. This is Tex Saga Babylonia. Although, more accurately, I'll be spending time speaking about Jerusalem, Tenatalan. This is of the time of King David. The Semitic peoples of the true biblical Americas have already discovered the city's foundation. They envisioned hundreds of years before, through the serpent god Yahweh in the Great Lakes region, after serving 400 years in a caste system of slavery in the land of Goshen, which was located on the Mississippi River in North America, these Semitic people fled across the coast of Texas, raiding periodically or waging war with the people they called Amalek, who were ISIS worshippers, who were they were an independent power upon themselves. This was the city of Jericho, located where Rockwall, Texas currently is. And these communities were formerly islands on the coast of the interior seaway, but were now city fortresses in the middle of great fields and deserts. It is from this venturing through Texas and using the coastlines that the Semitic peoples ventured as far south as the Gulf of Campeche into Acapulco into the northern Yucatan. This northern Yucatan area was where they also decided to go westward through the central Mexican valleys into the southern mountainous areas and into where currently Mexico City is. Remember, this was a tense, very, very large show of bravado of these newcomers that were mingling, not always peacefully, in fact, many times very bloodily, with the locals. But were doing so with so much force and unity in their tribe that they muscled in and were able to claim literally an island inside of 5 lakes. While this was not coveted land, this was the land that was interpreted to be the visionary city whose omen would be an eagle sitting on a cactus eating a serpent. The high priests of the Semitic peoples, the priests of Aaron, who we would know as Aaron, the priests of Moses, the priests of these Semitic peoples who led this journey, this exodus, that had survived 2 full generations, with the original participants dying completely and being replaced fully by individuals who were not alive when the exodus started. That's how much hardship, and that's how long this exodus truly was. This migration of a displaced people, a former slave caste that had basically escaped after a failed rebellion, or at least in their rebellion chose to escape as means of a rebellion instead of waging a rebellion that would have failed. They escaped, taking their work with them, away from the lands of Goshen that had used their service to build pyramids with dirt across the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. After claiming Tenochtitlan as in the parallels to the inverted and geographically inaccurate Old Testament, the Torah, the Pentateuch, as well as conventional academic and theological understandings of the Old Testament and the Bible. This is what I'm saying is extremely heretical by every single established religion, from Catholic to Protestant, across Islam, and across Judaism. Anything that heralds the authenticity of quote-unquote Abrahamic traditions as they're presented as occurring in North Africa, the Middle East, or the Mediterranean is fundamentally incorrect, because they are discussing the inverted history of mankind. The history which is fundamentally reversed. When they can get you looking in the wrong area, they don't have to worry about answering the right questions. They want you to believe that through various acts of God, and apparently the amazing erosion of time that selectively chooses holy sites of Semitic Abrahamic origins and not secular historical sites like random towns and cities and marketplaces, roads and stuff like that, from the less glamorous aspects of the history of the locality and stuff. And so that would explain why there's really no evidence for any of what occurs in much of the Old Testament, especially from the periods of the Exodus. So all of Genesis is a mystery, an allegory and up for debate. Then there is the up to the flood, and then everything after the flood is completely guesswork because there isn't archaeological evidence for the Exodus in Africa, Egypt, or the Red Sea, or the Middle East. There's no real logical reason for any of it as it's written to have occurred. 40 years wandering in the desert, even if you take that as a metaphor, meaning simply for a long time, the journey across Egypt to the Mediterranean is easily doable within a year, let alone if you had to take a more circuitous route, there would be even greater evidence as there would be a longer and more permanent need for settlement and resources, etc. And then of course, there's the seemingly historical lack of evidence for most of the religious figures. In the old world, most of the cities, for example, just seemingly do not exist any longer, like Babylon or Troy or most of the Middle East, most of the Israelite, the kingdom of Israel, most of the kingdom of Judea, most of the kingdom of Babylon, Sumeria, all that's lost of the ages. Entire wonders like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, completely gone. We don't have a shred of evidence that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were actually where we say Babylon is. And yet we want to believe that we know for a fact that these things were in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. The fact is, the reason why there's so little archaeological evidence is because these things occurred in North America, Central America, specifically around Mexico, Florida, the Gulf Coast, and the Caribbean, as well as the North Coast of South America and the Pacific Coast of South America as well. And the facts of the matter are, archaeologically, anthropologically, however you want to break it down, the real objective facts are, these locations, which I just listed, the west coast of South America, the North Amazonian area of South America, the lands of Central America, the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast of the United States, Mexico, Florida, etc., and the Mississippi River, Ohio River Valley. All of them have thousands, literally thousands, of settlements, cities, roads, pyramids, places of worship, markets, farmlands, like developed farmlands, agricultural evidence such as the Amazon rainforest being completely artificial, given that there's topsoil at the measurement of feet that is man-made. It's from bioash. It's a type of agricultural fertilizer. To the fact that LiDAR is proving the fact that there are there are cities interconnected with highway systems throughout all of this area that are paved with concrete from actual, like rock and stone, not pebbles, not laid stonework like the Roman roads, but actually large, visible from the air, interconnected grid work and infrastructure that's highly sophisticated city planning. Now, we're taking a massive amount of resources, a massive amount of organization, far beyond a civilization that, for example, doesn't have the wheel or doesn't have domesticated animals or something like they're trying to tell us. Like, oh, they didn't have anything but llamas and they didn't have the wheel. Like in North America, they want you to believe that Native Americans didn't have the wheel and shit. And it's just fucking retarded because there are thousands of pyramids made of soil, from soil samples that can trace themselves to all corners of North America, from the Pacific coast to the East Coast, meaning that they brought these soil samples ritualistically. So, I mean, the thing is, it's apparent to me and it's obvious to me, given the lack of megalithic cities, remains, ruins across the Middle East, North Africa, Africa itself, the interior of Africa being mostly empty, Europe having, statistically, for what it is, supposed to be a heartland of all urbanization, all infrastructure, all civilization. Basically, the birthplace of technology is Europe, correct? Well, if that's the case, most of Europe is 100%, medieval or Renaissance era. There's very little ancient stuff. For what it is worth, they didn't know where Troy was, which is seemingly one of the more historically famous secular cities, until the 1800s. And that's just, that's a head scratcher. Most of the medieval descriptions, Renaissance descriptions of Europe are completely forested. At most you have cottages and hamlets, no man's land of mountains and forests. And it's basically, to travel anywhere, it's seemingly impossible, especially in the winter. Which is not like you would suspect of the effects after 1,000 or 2,000, 3,000 years of human civilization, of human development. That being said, I think it's also a point to mention that, conventionally speaking, the Western Hemisphere and its peoples and its many different empires were far more wealthy and far more sophisticated in many aspects of life, including hygiene, religion, with organizational structures being the metric of how you gauge these things. You know, that than the East ever was. The East was suffering from bubonic plague and holy wars and things like that. And for example, London, you know, it had fewer people living in it, and was smaller than Tenochtitlan was when the Spanish discovered it. Hundreds of thousands of people could live easily in luxury in the cities of the West. With this is conventionally accepted reality. That when the Spanish arrived, the Spanish were stricken with syphilis. They came from countries filled with rats and disease. They had just survived 800 years of war with the Muslims, and had just won back Spain. They had literally they just retook control of Iberia from the Moors, like 8 years before they found the new lands. Less than 10 years before they found the new lands. And think of the Aztecs. The Aztecs had a full empire of millions of people. They had astronomical knowledge. They had calendar systems the number 0. They had the ability to build pyramids that still last to this day. Gold, so much, you know. And then they want you to think, though, that the Europeans were superior, and that history happened the way that they've written it. Well, we know his story is completely inaccurate. We know that, especially the Bible and everything, timelines are all fucked up. They've added 1,000 years, you know, to European history. They added 1,000 years and took away 1,000 years from the Western history. It's 100% the case that they learned the history of the West, rewrote it to be the history of the East, and decided to fucking recreate the history later when they developed the technology to do so. They didn't care that they hadn't discovered any of the shit that they were describing in the Bible in Egypt yet. They didn't care that they didn't have a single shred of archaeological evidence for Jerusalem or any of the Israelite cities in the Middle East in Palestine. They didn't care that Israel really wasn't in Palestine. They didn't care that any of the shit that didn't happen in ancient Greece. They didn't have any of the ancient cities or any of the monuments or any of the stuff back there. They knew no one was going to hold them accountable. But they knew they had to start lying if they were going to brainwash the generations of people moving forward in the centuries to come, in the decades to come. They just knew they had to start lying. And they did this around the 1700s. They did this around the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. So by the 20th century, you have people who have never, ever understood the truth, never, ever learned the truth. You have literally hundreds of years, like the earliest, think about it, from the 1600s to the 1800s, of just endless rewriting, revision, re-editing. You have rabbinical scholars coming out of the woodwork talking about lineages. This is really when you get the creation of the Protestant Bible. This is really when you start getting the creation of these Freemasonic, Protestant, Illuminati, mostly Talmudic, mostly Semitic, Hebrew, converted / anti-Catholic, and even the Catholics too. I mean, the Catholics really don't even talk about how they viewed history. They've revised their history so many times, but they were eventually co-opted into this grand lie too, and they started full forcing this fake picture of history, which has completely covered up the biblical inheritance of the West. They attempted to steal and loot as much of that history as possible. They attempted to burn as many books as possible that would connect these events to historical realities. They, for example, just burned down the Brazilian Museum in 2017. Irreplaceable amounts of history and treasure, because it proves something. That the origins of man, the origins of all society, the origins of all religion, the Abrahamic faiths, arise in the Americas. They arise in the biblically ancient lands of the Americas. Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, was in around Florida. We already discussed this on our first part. Land of Goshen was the Mississippi River Valley. Babylon, or Atlantis, remember we talked about Atlantis. Atlantis was going to be the East Coast, all the way down. And then Mu was the West, Southwest. There was an ocean in between America separating them. This East and West conflict ended up, starting basically shattering the world. And we keep going into now, this Land of Goshen era. The Exodus has just occurred, so we're getting to actually more modern eras. Remember, this is not too long ago. This is like 2000 BC. This is now like within that 2000, 1000 era BC. Right? And so at this point, there are people living on the Eastern Hemisphere. There are people living in Europe. They're colonizing Europe. They're colonizing the Mediterranean. They're colonizing North Africa. We're not going to be speaking about them. Now let's focus on what's going on in this central Mexican valley, Tenochtitlan. Let's talk about how that's Jerusalem. How the history of this Tenochtitlan and the history of Jerusalem are the same. Now, you can't say they're exactly the same because the revisions, the rewriting, etc. And as before, I mentioned that when they mention in the Bible are the biblical translations that we're reading the King James Version or whatever, certain individuals like Saul, King David, Solomon, for example, these weren't their real names. There's not a fucking chance these were their real names. And we know that, the Hebrew itself was made in the 1920s. Hebrew is not an ancient language. And then they say, well, they spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was not the language that they spoke. They spoke Mayan. Now, I do not know Mayan. I don't think anyone knows Mayan except a handful of select natives of this area. And I know for a fact that not a single person really knows how to read Mayan. That is one of the more fascinating facts of the modern day, linguistical world. Is that Mayan and Aztec, all these languages, which we called them Mayan. They didn't call themselves Mayan even. And Maya to them was a greeting. But even then, to call them their greeting as ill-dignified and kind of, like brushing that off as it is, choosing to learn nothing about their own identification, choosing to call them, like calling the Hawaiians the Aloha, or the Mexicans the Hola, or the Americans the Hello people, and thinking you accurately understand this group, you intuitively know that this group cannot be the people of the Bible, because this other group tells you that they're that group of the Bible, and thinking we know, like academy, universities know, theologians know, priests know, Catholic friars and stuff, they know because they've researched, they read the books, they know the truth. They don't know shit. No one knows shit when it comes to this, because they were intentionally erased. They were burned, they were persecuted, they were sold into slavery, they were moved around, their identity was literally scrubbed away from them as they were brainwashed to become new people. And you think, why? Well, I'm going to tell you why. Because if you look at it metaphorically, if you look at it gnostically, look at it from the parallels, there's only the likelihood that the events behind the Mayan and ultimately the Aztec realities of the founding of Tenochtitlan, the rise of their kings and the worship of their god, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who would be equally represented as the ruler of the sky, the god of the sun, both the serpent and the eagle, with the intersection being the feathered serpent, whose planet was Venus in the night sky, and whose avatar as a man was blonde-haired and blue-eyed with white skin. To think that all those things were coincidental, like Quetzalcoatl was just a local superstition made by some savages, is absolutely foolish. The chances of that not being the exact definition of the phoenix of the Western world, or rather the archetype for what we know as the real messianic, Mithraic, or Morning Star type faith origins that we associate with the Eastern world, that they actually originally would occur in the religions of the West. What do we know of King David? What do we know of King Saul? What do we know of Solomon? We know that they were a lineage to each other. First Saul, then David, then Solomon. We know these were not real individuals. We know that's not their real names. Nor, I mean that by this wasn't the actual 100% literal fundamental descriptions of these individuals' lives. There's a lot we don't know, a lot edited out, but what we do know, we can start piecing together pictures. Let's look at the history of Tenochtitlan. We can start breaking the parallels down as we go along. Remember, Saul was the first king in Jerusalem. He was chosen by his priest class, who directed him to wage bloodthirsty, total warfare against who they thought were the enemies of this Quetzalcoatl, described in the Bible as the Philistines. But who I believe were a tribe that is known as the Tarascus. There were many, many tribes that existed in this valley around Tenochtitlan. Just like there were many tribes that existed around Jerusalem. There were Philistines, there were Canaanites, there were Syrians, there were Samaritans, there were Babylonians, there were Persians, there were Assyrians, etc., etc., etc. That can easily be understood with the parallel of these many diverse peoples that coexisted under ruling cities, each with their own governing tribes. The lands were bloody. No man's lands as skirmishing warrior bands fought for slaves and honor, as well as raiding unguarded weak civilizations. This was not enough to provoke total war. In fact, it was a very complex society where this was expected as signs of strength and livelihood, where warrior castes were just a part of everyday life, where they may kill you, slave you, or rob you if you were caught by them unawares, or in hostile territory. The act of killing, instead of taking as slave or hostage, was taboo to these people. In fact, quite horrifying. They understood the logic of being taken hostage because of one's value. But the idea of being slaughtered because of another's cold-blooded death cult, that was something all too alien for these people. Though they practiced human sacrifice, it was ritualized as a soul was offered to a specific deity. These newcomers who lived in Jerusalem under this new priest class, a new king, waged an alien total war where they would attack their enemies if provoked and slaughter every single person, man, woman, or child. This was a tactic they had learned while traveling through Texas, the lands of Amalek. These are the tactics that they used against the people that surrounded the Natalan, their neighbors. There were several things that occurred during this time, which are of monumental importance, which are spoken about during the Old Testament, or in the Old Testament, that shape the geographical reality of Jerusalem and Natalan. Saul's rise to power and his refusal to kill the king of the Philistines after being directly commanded to by the high priest of Jerusalem, the high priest of Israel, who was himself directly communicated by God. You have, that led to his curse, that led to his death, his madness, his wickedness was explained as allowing him to be possessed by the devil, as well as the rise of King David, the young lion, the new lion of Judah, that was allowed to usurp him, taking his daughter as a wife, ruling as a warrior, as well as a spiritual leader, until the temptations of his power became his undoing. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And then a third heir in this throne being his son, the son of the preacher, the son of the king, Solomon the wise, who under his era, Jerusalem would see its golden age. It would expand. It would become a kingdom, an empire in its own right. And it would do so both with war and with philosophy and with trade. And its merchants would travel the known world, bringing back riches like diamonds and exotic spices, and nations and tribes from all over would supplicate and deliver caravans of gifts, from exotic spices to literally concubines and women, to be given to the men of Jerusalem and to Natalan, specifically to Solomon the king, a man who is described as having 1,500 wives and many hundreds extra concubines, lovers, mistresses, princesses he deflowered, random peasant women he thought were hot, etc., etc., etc. This man also practiced, quote, the dark arts or astronomy, depending on how you look at it, and was able to, even in the most conservative terms, use supernatural influences and powers to help better construct this empire and to help better construct this temple. Doesn't sound too, I guess you would call it, godly to me. In fact, it only really makes sense, this as a secular history of a specific tribe of people, a dynasty of people, as they morphed from the warrior kings of old to a priest class in their golden age, a return from the hardships of the Exodus, from the hardships of their slavery in Goshen, to the priest class from their lineage of the Baracushians, the Noahide, from before the great fall of the Tower of Babel. For example, let me just describe the city plans of Tenatalan and imagine in your mind what this sounds like. When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, we were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments on account of the great towers and quays and buildings rising from the water and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. I do not know how to describe it, seeing things as we did that had never been heard of or seen before, not even dreamed about. This was written by Bernal Diaz de Castillo from the conquest of New Spain. The city itself was divided into 4 zones, or camps. Each camp was divided into 20 districts. And each large house, or lodge, was crossed by streets. There were 3 main streets that crossed the city, each leading to one of the 3 causeways to the mainland. They were wide enough for 10 horses standing side by side. And surrounding the raised causeways were artificial floating gardens with canal waterways and gardens of plants, shrubs, and trees. The cupolas were divided by channels used for transportation, with wood bridges that were removed at night. The earliest European images of the city were woodcuts, published in Augsburg, though, around 1522. So with that, mind you, the first images of the city were actually made in Europe, not by anyone who had actually seen the city. They were made from the written word as they described this. Cortez, for example, estimated that the market of Tenochtitlan was twice the size of the city of Salamanca, and 60,000 people traded there daily. This was, according to Bernardo de Sahugen, a feast day, and a more conservative estimate places 20,000 ordinary customers on an average day. Socially, remember how Jerusalem was made up. It was a city controlled by the Hebrews, by the Israelites. And to have any ruling status or permanent residency, you had to belong to their religion. I said there are 3 or 4 main events that happen. One is the marriage of Esther into the Hebrew faith. This is the marriage from the southern kingdom of Judea and the conventional Old Testament that allows the northern tribes of Israel to double their empire, to create the alliance, although be it with a pagan, aka outsider, faction, as well as attempt to convert them to their religion. That of the Quetzalcoatl worship, that of the serpent worship. People don't know this, but in all honesty, ancient Hebrews, ancient Israelites had a symbol of a bronze snake on a staff. And in the first temple of Jerusalem, there was the Ark of the Covenant, and there was Aaron's rod with the bronze serpent, the blooming rod with the bronze serpent. In the same tent of Shiloh, they were serpent worshippers. Once again, more of a Mesoamerican, Mexicanaanite type tradition. They brought the serpent worship. The others worshipped things like the rain gods. Canaanites, the Philistines, etc., worshipped things that we know as Baal, or the rain god, who in Mesoamerica was known as Tlaloc, or Tlaloc. There are parallels to all of this. Now the kings. Let's describe the kings. Basically, with Saul, you have the warrior kings taking over power, but eventually themselves either being poisoned, which is the occurrence that happens to most of the emperors in this early age of the city of Tenochtitlan. Just like Jerusalem, just like Israel, the Mexica saw a vision on what was then of God, telling them of a holy land, of a promised valley. And not deterred by unfavorable terrain or long exodus, set about traveling to, finding, and then building the city. They used the Chinampa system, misnamed as floating gardens for agriculture and to dry and expand the island. Remember, the floating gardens, or the hanging gardens of Babylon, have never been discovered. They were never in the Middle East. The floating gardens, the hanging gardens, are literally an aspect of the creation of this Western super city, known as Tenochtitlan. A thriving culture developed, and the Mexican civilization came to dominate other tribes around Mexico. They either converted them through marriage or enslaved them through war. Remember, this is the era of Saul. The small natural island was perpetually enlarged as Tenochtitlan grew to become the largest and most powerful city in Mesoamerica. Their commercial routes were developed that brought goods from places as far as Gulf of Mexico, the Pacific Ocean, and perhaps even the Incan Empire. They were trading across continents. This is at the end, the King Solomon the Wise, and his golden era of Israel. And to explain the parallels here, we have to think about this in terms that are so revolutionary. They're so mind-blowing that even I, as I express them, realize that it's absolutely considered heresy to think this way, which means it's definitely the way to pursue. In the conventional history of the social classes of Tenochtitlan, we consider the most complex society in Mesoamerica in regards to social stratification. The complex system involved many social classes. There were commoners who lived outside the island city, Tenochtitlan. There were noblemen who were relatives of leaders and former leaders, and they lived in the confines of the island, well guarded, behind many walls. There were the eagle nobles, who were commoners who impressed the nobles with their martial prowess and bravery, and were treated as nobles socially. There were the highest class of rulers of various parts of the empire that were related by blood. This included the king. There were slaves and indentured servants for all of these castes as well. And there were merchants who traveled all of Mesoamerica's known lands and explored for more. The membership of this class was based solely on heredity. And the highest classes could become very rich because they did not pay taxes. But they had to sponsor the temples and ritual feasts from the wealth they obtained from their trade expeditions. Think about how much wealth King Solomon is described as obtaining during his rule. And think of how beloved he was for his ceremonies and his construction with that wealth of the second temple, the Temple of Solomon. That wealth that they talk about obtaining during the Kingdom of Solomon is written about in the life and history of the Aztecs' greatest ruler. That ruler was named Ahuatzotl. Ahuatzotl was an Aztec warrior who reigned, conventionally understood to reign, around 1486 or 1502 CE. He was one of the greatest generals of the ancient Americas, and his nephew, Montezuma, was known as a living god. That's how enlarged and consolidated the empire had become, due to his ruthlessly terrorized the neighboring tribes into acceptance of Aztec rule and submission. He undertook huge building projects, and each victory was celebrated by a mass of human sacrifices, mostly captured enemies to honor the gods. The reign of Huatzil was known as the Golden Age. Huatzil was the third son of the Aztec king Moctezuma. His name, appropriately enough as it would turn out, was associated with a mythical hyper-aggressive otter that lived at the bottom of a lake. Remember, this is all unnecessary name, and they want you to think of names. They want you to think of this stuff as permanently written stone. You have to have these identities, and these identities are inflexible, yet they know so much about it because that locks it into place. But that's not the case. It's not the case at all. Solomon would mean the man of the sun, for example, as it was described later on. And this is all the interpretations from glyphs, mind you, hieroglyphics, mind you, that were used as signatures in an ununderstood language. What is known, though, is Huatzil took over the Aztec supreme ruler position after the former was poisoned. Remember, a lot of these Aztec leaders are poisoned and die from wasting away, or die from curses or disease of black magic or curses from God. Just like Saul and David died from wasting diseases after their lives turned to the direction of sin, after they started making enemies and disobeying the priest class. At the time, the Aztecs' enemies were the Tarascans. Like I said, I think those were the Philistines, the Tarascans. All of them, the Cans, were Canaanites, the Mexicans, for example. The Lord of Huatzotl was the 8th Aztec ruler, and he is described in Aztec texts as a youthful, strong, energetic, and audacious one. He was a mere youth when he took power, and had to be brought from school on the death of the other ruler that had already displayed a great maturity beyond his years. He was helped in these early years by the traditional king's advisor, the priest class. From there, he built a strong bond with them and always kept religion as the foremost of his attentions. He expanded their empire and quickly established a reputation as a gifted military leader by winning his first battle in the traditional coronation war, which is more traditional symbolic fighting in a civil war. Leading his army in person and fighting alongside his warriors, the Toluca Valley rebellions were quashed one by one, with many of their villages looted and sacrificial victims procured in mass. The victory was celebrated by the largest feast in Tenochtitlan history. Quetzalcoatl then proceeded to bring the Gulf Coast territories into line after their stubborn refusal to pay tribute. This was another victory, and Quetzalcoatl would go on to win many more, conquering the central valleys of Oaxaca. The Aztecs moved as far south as the Guatemalan border, and even beyond, in order to encompass lucrative cacao-producing regions. They also campaigned as far west as the Pacific Ocean, perhaps in long-term strategies to outflank their rivals, the arch-enemy Tarascans, who had developed forts on the borders. The result of this expansion was that Quetzalcoatl created the largest area yet brought under Aztec control. Although the Aztec armies concentrated on enemy cities, their empire would only ever be a loose collection of tribute-paying subject states. Remember the true geopolitical state of ancient Israel. Quetzalcoatl did attempt to establish a more permanent Aztec presence by building Aztec monuments in such conquered cities as Tepoztlan, Malinaco, and I said, once you get to the names, they want you to think these are actually their real names, but they want you to think these are definitely, like, unless you know these pronunciations and these specific things, that nothing else could have happened there. You know, this is just literally the known world. And it's at this time, remember what happened with Solomon too. He started worshiping outsider gods, false gods. It's represented in the Old Testament as sacrificing to Baal with the Queen of Sheba. But at this time, Solomon starts incorporating local gods into the Aztec pantheon in an effort to further bind the diverse cultures of Mesoamerica. So just like King Solomon, who is in his prime, when he begins to worship, or when he lays a sacrifice to Baal for the Queen of Sheba, who is a black-skinned woman considered from an exotic, faraway land, this Aztec pantheon includes foreign gods under the rule of their greatest ruler, in an attempt to appease the diverse cultures that are included in this new empire. Remember, King Solomon had mines, and he encouraged trading and wealth. Trade was encouraged in some areas by Quetzalcoatl, specifically by the Pacheco warrior traders who were given the privilege to create and wear jewelry and feathers by Quetzalcoatl. Such was their importance in a strategy to open new territories by whatever means suited the situation, be they violent or peaceful. At the same time, more troublesome peoples, e.g. the Ostomen and the Alosoan, were ruthlessly and systematically wiped out during the reign of Quetzalcoatl. Remember how they brought war, total war. They would kill every single man, woman, children, and animal that an enemy tribe possessed. These tribes knew war, but they expected to be taken prisoner, to be allowed to live. Their women and children were expected to be slaves. Not this time. They would ruthlessly and systematically wipe out, just like the people of Israel waged war against the people of Amalek. It's the same fucking story. The names are different, but it's the same key identities. But Quetzalcoatl also greatly increased the number of human sacrifices carried out in the various Aztec religious ceremonies. These were designed to appease their gods and celebrate military victories. Famously, 80,400 war captives were sacrificed over 4 days atop the Templo Mayor Pyramid Temple at Tenochtitlan. Most historians discount this number as impossibly high, but the writing is what it is. This was depicted in the Codex Tellurion Remensis. Not only did sacrifices help to appease the gods and ensure a continuation of the Aztec world, but Quetzalcoatl used the spectacle to terrify the visiting rulers of newly conquered territories and ensure their passive compliance to Aztec rule. Now, just like Jerusalem, the second temple, the Temple of Solomon, this Quetzalcoatl was very busy being the grand original architect of his universe. This guy literally was a master mason in terms of his work and the creation of such hewn stone monuments, pyramids that have never been equaled. They didn't do this shit in the Middle East. This shit was never done in Palestine. This stuff was never done where they say Israel and Jerusalem are currently. You can't find me pyramids of this magnitude, of this size and this scale. They are superior to the Great Pyramids of Egypt. This was truly King Solomon's temple, the temple to the sun, the temple Ma'ir. The most significant such project of his building and his expansion of Tenochtitlan was the Templo Ma'ir. It was inaugurated to the giant monument to the rain god Leloch and the war god Huitzilopochtli. And this is where the 80,000 captives were sacrificed. Remember, Solomon began to worship pagan gods, specifically Baal, the god of storms. And the war god, Jehovah. Another giant project of Huitzotl was the construction of a large canal to bring fresh water from the Calliocan to Tenochtitlan. However, in a version recounted by Durin, the project got off to a bad start when it brought so much water that it flooded the city. Uh-oh, another flood? That's right. The priest blamed the disaster on the fact that Huitzotl had rashly killed a ruler of the Calliocan people. And so this was revenge from Chalohuatlali, the water goddess. Now the death convention, now the accepted, his story, quote unquote, his story, states that his death came at a mysterious time when he contracted a strange and fatal disease. Also, to kind of point out how alien all of this is and how poorly translated this is to any kind of converted timeline, he died in the year 10 Rabbit. Good luck thinking that you know the real timeline of events. He died in the fucking year 10 Rabbit. Make sense of that. Another version of events, the king died from a blow to the head while he was trying to escape the flood at Tenochtitlan. Death by a wasting disease suggests that he has been poisoned, like his predecessors before them. Such was the competition between the members of the ruling family to possess the title which permitted the holder semi-divine status, head priesthood, and control of the armies. In a lavish ceremony, Huitzotl was cremated on a funeral pyre atop the Templo Ma'ir he had constructed, and his ashes buried beneath the nearby sacred precincts gardens. Now, remember, King Solomon, when he died, left his empire to the last kings of Jerusalem, of the southern Judean district, not the northern Israeli tribes, the 12 tribes, the ones who had made the Exodus, who had chosen to live in the northern districts, but he had given it to a member of the southern Judean districts, having no heir of his own. And those that took control of Jerusalem were the last rulers before Babylon enslaved them. Before Babylon, the Syrians and an alliance of their enemies attacked, invaded, sacked and looted their temples, their cities, their markets, and their homes, put the people to the sword, took their young men and women into bondage, and smashed the skulls of their infants on the rocks of the river of Zion. This is how the Old Testament, conventionally, the timeline is understood to occur. Solomon rises, there's the golden age of biblical Israel, Jerusalem, the creation of the Temple of Solomon. Then that golden age fades into an era of corruption, of evil kings, of the time right before Daniel, of apostasy, of heresy, of paganism, of false idol worship, perversion, etc., from these chosen people, the people of the vision, who had made the Exodus, who had inherited the Holy Land, who had fought for it, who had won it, who had turned it into a prosperous, thriving empire from a group of little fight clubs. But upon the worship of outside deities, had grown too complex and was poisoned from its core and taken over by an outsider sent by God to humble them. Or at least as we understand it. Now, just like that, almost 100%, just like that, a parallel, it may not be 100%, but it definitely is within 90, 80%. If you looked at this, this is identical almost. Of conventional history, has it that after Huitzotl dies, that his children, that his heirs, the people who take the throne after him, remember, after his wasting disease, remember how Solomon died? After he blasphemed, he went mad. He had a disease. Mental illness is a disease that saw him die slowly and ignobly. A shadow of his former self. a shadow of his former glory. But that Owatzattl's heirs that he passed this prosperous empire to were tragically the last true Aztec rulers, known in his story, as his nephew Menacazama Zocotzotlán, otherwise known as Montezuma, who historically was faced and murdered by the visitors from the Old World in 1520 CE. That was the chaos of the Spanish conquest. That this Owatzatl, the literal Western King Solomon, remember, he did not leave his heir to his son, but the kings, the illegitimate kings that took over after him, immediately were invaded, enslaved, looted, put to the sword, their young men and women sold into slavery, disease brought to their land, their gold stolen by outsiders. I mean, it's the story of biblical Israel. It's the story of the bondage, of going into bondage of Babylon. It's the story from King Saul, through King David, through King Solomon, through the last kings of Israel, the bondage of Babylon. Different names, different places, different details, but it's roughly the same thing, including the giant building of a temple, the inclusion of foreign gods, the creation of these dynasties built on war and conquest and slaughter, etc., etc., etc. What isn't happening, though, here, I think, is the timeline. And the timeline is obviously not correct. And I have to say that right now, too. I don't think the Babylonians were the Spanish. And I don't think the Spanish actually took over the real Aztecs. I think by this time, remember, they did not call themselves the Aztecs either. That was the history of the city, Tenochtitlan. What the Spanish did was conquer the city. They did not conquer these people. These people were, in fact, conquered, though, but not by the Spanish, but by outsiders from the real biblical Babylon. The real biblical Babylon, just like in the old ancient world, just like in the established conventional Freemasonic version of reality, the Talmudic version of reality, took over these people who, while being mighty, while being powerful, were still smaller than the superpowers in the areas, Babylonia being one of them. And what I'm firmly aware happened, just like it's alluded to in the chronologies of the Old Testament, etc., is that during the trade and expansion of this Mexican Israel, of this Mexican Jerusalem, Tenochtitlan, and its people, they made contact through their expansion, through their trading, through their exploration, with representatives of Babylon. Babylon being the east coast of the United States. Remember, this is after they made the Exodus. This is about, I'd say, roughly 100, maybe 200 years. Maybe about 200 years after, like, less, 150 years approximately. Maybe a little bit 100, maybe a little bit near the 200, but around 150 years. Between the establishment, or between the escape, sorry, let's begin, the beginning of the Exodus, and the point when they make contact with merchants and colonies of Babylon in the Gulf of Mexico, around Florida, around the Caribbean. Remember, they're escaped slaves. These people, while they may be kings, are escaped slaves from Goshen. They have betrayed and are outlaws to the Pharaoh of Goshen. Just because they escaped, just because they made good on that escape and are not dead yet, does not mean that shit has been forgiven. Does not mean they still don't owe the debt or are going to be punished at the first possible opportunity by this Goshen. Or, in this case, some element of Goshen, an ally, internal power, this colony, this vassal state, sister state, something like this. Like how Washington, D.C. in the United States of America, one is the capital of, and specifically the ruling center of, the ruling culture of an entire country that stretches from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. Babylon, centered in New York City, or where current New York City is, or where the current Washington, D.C. is, or somewhere between that metropolitan, that Babylonian system orders this Tenochtitlan Jerusalem city-state empire to be enslaved, to be returned to their slavery in Goshen, regardless of their strength, regardless of their position of autonomy, regardless of their newly found independence in a foreign land. Babylon orders its armies to march to this place and conquer them. Remember, like I said, it's like how you say Washington, D.C. and America. Washington, D.C. might be a little bitty city. It might be, hey, it's a big city, but it's a little bitty city with like a couple of million people, right? But it can order the juggernaut of the American military from its offices in the Pentagon. And just like how America operates, Babylon operated then too. From their occult centers of power behind their walled cities of Babylon, they controlled vast territories with millions of soldiers from hundreds of thousands of cities, villages, tribes, nomads, etc. Most of these were already slaves, in the sense that they could not refuse commands from Babylon. Just like how the United States and its many different police forces, National Guard units, military branches, military veterans members are slaves to the United States of America and cannot disobey their orders. If DC says you're going to war with Mexico, it doesn't matter if you're from California. It doesn't matter if you're from Colorado. It doesn't matter if you're from Florida. If DC says America is going to war with Mexico, then we, as America, all 50 states, all the National Guard units, all the bases, all the many different peoples and tribes and cities will provide the troops. We cannot refuse the orders. They'll provide the vehicles, the bullets, the manpower. They'll get the war machine moving. And then America and its might, under the orders of DC, would invade and destroy Mexico, or have that war against Mexico. The same thing happened in this ancient world. Babylon ordered its forces, Babylonia, to invade Israel, to take over Jerusalem. And no matter how strong their armies were, it's beyond David and Goliath. It's a superpower versus a city-state. And as they surged in, they took the Ark of the Covenant. They took, scattered their religious iconography. Either that was hidden or was absolutely destroyed. This is how the Old Testament's written conventionally, right? And then the people of Jerusalem, the people of Israel, are sold into slavery. They're sold into slavery. Babies are dashed on the rocks of the river Zion. They're made to sing their songs, etc. You know, as they're being walked off into slavery. Absolutely humbled. This is where you get the bondage of Babylon. This could mean, like as it did, that they are taken, like in the Old Testament, that they are taken to one specific city. And that one specific city being the heart of Babylon, where King Nebuchadnezzar is personally put into his retinue. I believe, though, that Daniel was special. Daniel obviously was special. This is not even like a case. Daniel was special. In the Old Testament, not every enslaved Israelite, or Judean actually, not every enslaved Judean, for the Israelites, fled into Assyria. Not every enslaved Judean was taken to Babylon, the city. They were taken across the territories. They were given camps outside. They were basically evenly distributed, right, across the land, with only maybe Daniel and a handful of the select privileged of being allowed in those center cities and those courts. This is exactly how the Atlanteans enslaved and distributed the black-skinned races from the Empire of Kush during that Third Age. This ends the Fourth Age. This ends the Fourth Age, as Israel is returned to bondage, not under Goshen directly, but under Babylon. These two, Babylon and Goshen, are basically so allied as to be one and the same. Babylon returns these people of Israel, these people of Yahweh the dragon, these people who were living in Jerusalem, that we now know as Tenochtitlan in the west, to bondage, where they had escaped from, estimated about 150 years before. Maybe 200 years. No one alive at this point remembers being a slave, but they know that that was where they escaped from. That's fresh in their memory. They know that this is a massive failure. And at many points in this time, they abandon their former identity. They abandon their former faith in mass. They abandon their former identity in mass, except for literally a handful of priests and those of the priest and artisan class. We will know as Daniel and the story of Daniel, and how in their intelligence, just like in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, just like in the story of Moses, as a slave, wise enough to communicate with the people of the kings, the families and dynasties of the kings, to present them the honest answers, the wisdom and the interpretations. Remember that the lineage of these Semitic peoples from Abraham, are the Noahide ruling class, one world, old world order priest class. These Semitics were the priest class of both these Semitics are the descendants of the priest class of Mu and Atlantis. They are still extremely intelligent. It's genetic. Access to Akashic records that surpasses all Chaldean or astronomical, soothsaying, alchemist, mumbo-jumbo, witch doctor, magician, learned craft. These people have an instinctual mastery over magic. Just like Moses and Aaron proved that their Semitic magic was more powerful than Egyptian Goshen magic. Daniel, or the person that we now know as Daniel, whatever his true name was, as a member of this priest class of Semitic people now returned to bondage in Babylon as the proxy of Goshen, becomes the literal preferred advisor to Nebuchadnezzar, the god king of Babylon. Right back, advising as the priest class. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And you really gotta appreciate just how full circle each of these eras truly is. From the first, second, third, and now this, the ending of the fourth era. And then the ending of the fourth era ends with Tignatalon, Jerusalem, being ravaged and basically emptied out. It will later be, returned to the Semitic peoples. But basically, let's describe Babylon a little bit more. In terms of what we know as the United States, you could easily understand the peoples and culture of Babylon. Not every single person is a turbo hedonist, but to see a man with mascara, nose piercings, face piercings, tattoos on his neck and on his hands and across his body, walking around, just shopping, would not alarm anyone in this old Babylon. To see two women holding hands, kissing while wearing witchcraft-type clothing and pendants and jewelry would not shock anyone. To see a transsexual prostitute or some sex worker plying their trade in public would not shock anyone. That is the debauchery, the real-life, everyday debauchery, that people could do drugs, pharmacopoeia, etc. It was considered, do what thou wilt. Just like it is now. Freedom, baby. And the city in the middle of all that freedom, New York City in America, Babylon in Babylonia, same fucking thing. Sure, the leadership, they were respectable. They were modest. They may have been flamboyant and ostentatious and wealthy, but they and their behavior, no matter how extreme and extravagant it was always the standard for success. And it was what influenced, impressed, and appealed to the masses below them. In Babylon, for example, in historical Babylon, it's known that their favorite game, a game that could literally change a person's life if they won it, was a game called the lottery. You can't make this shit up. And the lottery of Babylon was played every few months, just like the lottery in America is played every few months. It's such an obvious one-on-one parallel. Nowhere else in the world, not through historical Middle Eastern world, not through anywhere else, Africa, Asia, China, anything, do people play the lottery as much as Americans do. It is a fundamental piece of our culture to play the lottery, to play the numbers. Where do you think we get this from? Our Babylonian roots. You can call Babylon America. You can call Babylonians Americans. It doesn't change the fact that they are Babylonians. Not to belabor the rise and fall of this Babylon, too, coincidentally enough, as their prime priest class became taken over and subverted by this new slave caste of Semitic peoples. These Semitic peoples, who were advisors, came at a time when their king, the god king, Nebuchadnezzar, was both at his most megalomaniacal and egotistical, and also at a time when he fell into insanity, probably poisoned. Just like how the kings of Tenochtitlan in Jerusalem all died from madness and a wasting disease. Nebuchadnezzar went from a man who his followers thought was a living god to a man who could not communicate even the most simple and basic of command, who stared at the sun and lived with wild animals, who couldn't shave or cut his nails until his feet and his hands looked like bird claws. That was the fate of the king of Nebuchadnezzar. Once these Semitic peoples, like Daniel, got close enough to him, got his trust, and got their competition, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, executed for incompetence. After a series of rulers, each with these Semitic advisors as their select priest class, after a series of these rulers appeared, one, he was either ordered or advised to release the Semitic prisoners back to whence they came. This can be interpreted as either he felt merciful for them and rewarded their good service once he was delivered the crown. Hint, hint. They killed his competition. They led to his being crowned king. And in return, he thanked them with delivering the political goal of releasing them from their bondage. Or that they were just such a big pain in the ass, driving the system of Babylon into collapse, causing its economic misfortune, and ruining the prestige of the nobles that they advised with their corruption and influence, that it was only wise to kick out these newly made slaves, throw them out like trash. For optimism's sake, for the romance of the story's sake, let's say they earned it and were given this as an honor. They earned their freedom and were released from this Babylonian bondage, officially no longer outlaws of Babylon or Goshen, no longer needing to pay the debt from this exodus that they conducted, and now able to pursue and return to their native lands. But here is the conundrum. Where are the native lands of these people, truly? Remember, as far as we can tell, they were Semitic peoples from Yosemite, not the city of Tenochtitlan, aka Jerusalem. They migrated as refugees, escaping slavery to central Mexico by way of Texas, by way of the Mississippi River Delta, New Orleans area, by way of the upper Mississippi River and Ohio River valleys, by way of the Great Lakes, Michigan, and Wisconsin area, by way of the Montana Badlands, and by way of the Yosemite territories. That's originally where Abraham and his people, his clan, called home. Now remember about real estate. The funny thing about real estate is that while no one likes to admit it, everyone knows where they belong. And everyone equally knows how serious it is for you to trespass on private property. You can't go to someone's house because you like it, knock on the door, and expect to be invited to live there. So now these people who are now kicked out of Babylon, are now free from Babylon, are expected to leave Babylon. But they don't have a home to go to that's not very far away, surrounded by hostiles, tribes that would rather see them dead, are bound into slave labor as revenge, or as simply unwelcome strangers in a desperate and hostile Western land. They can't make up their minds. Remember, a lot of these people have abandoned their identities. They have abandoned their old faith. They adopted Babylonian identities. They adopted Babylonian faiths. But I believe that wouldn't have saved them. The edict was too universal, that the Israelites were to be kicked out and to return to Zion, or to Israel, to Judea. And remember, many of the Israelites, the people of the Exodus, as it's told, were not taken by Babylon. They fled. They fled into what's called Assyria. Assyria are the deserts, the northern Mexican Mojave Desert regions. They fled. They ran into these Assyrian wastelands. 12 tribes worth of people fled. And only the southern Judeans, the people who had converted to the Semitic lifestyle, the Semitic people's way of life, who were allowed to live within the city, were taken bondage. That means that the Babylonians, that means that the Semitic peoples that are formerly slaves of Babylon, that are currently in Babylon, are split between two identities. They're split between people who want to return to where Yosemite National Park is currently. They want to return to Utah and Zion National Parks currently. That's the names of these areas currently. They want to return to the Utah territories. They want to return to Yosemite. They want to return to the American West and the Colorado Rocky Mountain areas. They want to return to these, their ancestral lands. Some of these they have never seen and have not returned to these lands literally for around 500 to 600 years. Maybe 700 years. Nearly 1,000 years, basically. They have not returned to their ancestral Semitic lands, these children of Abraham, since the patriarchs, the sons of Abraham, decided it would be best during a famine to try to raid Goshen. And that somehow ended up with them being permanently enslaved as a caste system for 400 years. This is only one side of the debate. The other side of the debate are the Judeans, the people who are locals, natives to the Mexican Valley, this valley of central Mexico, where Jerusalem/Tenochtitlan still exists as a city, with all its neighboring cities, with all the neighboring kingdoms and tribes. They want to go back there. These are the people that we would know as the Judeans, the southern Judean Valley, the people of Esther, who converted into the Semitic faith and blood by marriage. They have less of an identity with the Semitics, having only converted into their city-state and only converted to their tribe. They want to go back home. They don't even know anything about Zion. They have no connection to this land Zion, besides ideologically, etc., besides their loyalty to the Semitic peoples. These people, after having rejected, remember, most of them completely rejected the vision, Quetzalcoatl, the serpent worship, rejected the Semitic rituals like circumcision, the ritual body modifications, the passages, the scripture. Most of them have zero remaining loyalty to any of that system. They want to go back home to the central Mexican area. And they're allowed to. These parties split into two groups. They no longer see eye to eye with each other internally. The truer Semitic peoples who have their loyalty to the original ways and the original patriarchs, the original clans, and the original tribes, they go back west to the Yosemite Zion territories. Along the way, they become the Native Americans of these regions. They become the Sioux. They become the Blackfoot. They become the Black Hawk, of Chicago. They become the tribes, the many different but major tribes of Native Americans between the Mississippi River west to the Pacific coast, the Snake River people, etc., etc. Some of these people never left, but these people return to these tribes. These people create their own unique identities through their experience and travels, yes, but they return to these tribes. The Ojibwa, stuff like that. They return to these Semitic and Zionist lands, or the original lands of Zion, in America, not in the Middle East, in America. And they become the Native Americans there. The Israelites that fled this Babylonian bondage, this Babylonian attack, that survived in the Assyrian waste of the American Southwest and northern Mexico, become the Navajo. They become the Comanche. They become the Scythian horseback warriors, the Tatanka, the the Apache. They become these warriors, who themselves are fierce invaders of this area, who bring a level of warfare, of total warfare and annihilation toward their enemies, including torture, mutilation, enslavement, etc., and do so mostly on horseback. But these people all have iconography that's similar, like swastikas. Remember, itself an Atlantean heraldry, because these people used to be the priest class and warrior classes from the one world, old world system of both Mu and Atlantis. These people build massive warrior clans, specifically the Comanche, as direct descendants and defenders of the Semitic Goshen, formerly Tenochtitlan, era rulers. They can trace their descendancy, trace their ancestry all the way back to Noah. That's how ancient these people's bloodlines truly are. And, you know, the interbreeding and the hybridization with the various locals, etc. Remember, I explained away how the skin colors all work, from Adama, the red man, Eve, the race of black skins, and Lilith, the red-haired, white-skinned people, with Noah being the blonde-haired, blue-eyed phenotypes. So, this being the case, now we have peoples throughout the West, Zion areas, that can trace themselves back to these original people of Abraham, with the inherited memories, with the First Nations concepts, with these real theosophic truths from these ancient ages inherent in their mythologies. We have people like the Hopi and the Comanche and stuff like that. Well, the Hopis are actually people of Mu. The Hopis are survivors of the people of Mu. But anyway, these desert people, the Pueblo, the Anasazi, etc., all these people can trace back their memories either to Mu or these ancestors or these inheritors, the descendants of these original eras, that all have trace memories in their religions, in their faiths, in their legends, in their ancestries, and their chronologies of kings and rulers and chieftains that go back to these ages of Mu, Atlantis, and even before. And then you have those Semitic converts, or the converts of converts, the foreigners who have converted into the system, the foreigners who have been initiated into the system, the foreigners who have married in the system, who at this point identify more closely with Babylonians and Babylon's religious system and system of laws than you do with any original monotheism, any original iconoclast belief system against these, you know, power-drunk, delusional, ambitious, but highly corrupted by power factions and forces of men. So these now Babylonized converts from this southern territory return. But it's not like anything that you can imagine as far as the timelines go, because we've never been told a proper, real timeline for this now fifth age. The age from destruction of the Second Temple, the reclamation of the Second Temple to its destruction in Rome, by Rome. What that truly represented, what that truly meant, and how that truly corresponds in the timelines of the world. Remember, we think this is either 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, plus in the old world of the Middle East, which is entirely wrong. We think of that whenever we casually think of the Bible, like, oh, Jesus Christ lived 2,000 years ago, and he lived, in Nineveh, and he lived in, Nazarene and stuff like that. And, like he burned Bethlehem 2,000 years ago on Christmas. No, it's 100% a children's version of reality. It's a fable. It's not how it worked at all. It's not, timelines aren't accurate like that. So they added 1,000 years to European history to make it seem much older, and they subtracted 1,000 years from the Western history to make it seem more recent. From the period of the reclamation of Jerusalem / Tenochtitlan / the Temple of Mayer / the Temple of Solomon. Remember, this is returning from bondage, to fleeing from bondage, being released from bondage by Babylon. The creation of that Jerusalem to when the events of Christ happened. And what that symbolically represents, what that truthfully represents, is about 500 years. With the events of Babylonian invasion and looting of Jerusalem to Tenochtitlan happening around 1000 AD, currently, as time is understood. And with this destruction of the Second Temple occurring around the year 1500 AD. These aren't ancient historical facts. And the Bible isn't something that happened 2,000 years ago in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, which inspired the Roman Empire, which was adopted Christianity, or which created Christianity, which was adopted by the Romans. And all of that history is false. All the European history is false. All the Middle Eastern history is false. All the North African history is false. And it's all very, very recent, because nothing was ever even constructed in these areas, outside of cities on the coast, like Venice, etc. And a few cities internally in the interiors of rather easily accessible countries, like Rome and Italy, for example. But all the major European cities are built on the water. They're built on the coast. And there are only a handful of impressive metropolises in the interiors of Europe, like Paris, etc. And even then, that's built on a river. And it's even more apparent that there was not 1,000 years of infrastructure developed when you look at countries like Russia or Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, where people are supposed to have lived for thousands of years. Yet there is nothing in terms of monolith or megalith or impressive construction or city or anything like that. There's no infrastructure, there's no ancient society or anything like that. And then they want you to believe the psyop that European history was actually this old by making up bullshit, like finding treasures, etc., in the middle of farmers' fields. Like finding an old king's body and burial under a parking lot in London or something like that. Which is just absurd, to think that history would not only occur, but be immediately forgotten and basically swallowed up by the oblivion of progress, despite all knowledge to the contrary being that Europeans value and treasure their history to an extreme degree, that people would literally forget where a king was buried, or forget where a battle occurred, or forget where a city was, or forget that, for example, Stonehenge was actually a much larger and more complex system. Like, no one would just paint it or write it down or talk about it or just draw it out or something and make sure that that survived by just telling people that it was important to, like, remember it. And they were like, oh, well, religion. We used to know where all that history was, but then Christianity came and told us to forget about it. Oh, that doesn't, like, where King Richard was the one that they found buried in the parking lot. Did the Christians tell you to forget where you buried your own king? Like, no, none of that makes any fucking sense, because it's 100% absurd. It's literally fake history. The real history, though, which is detailed in extreme chronologies, despite the fact that the original language has been intentionally erased and confused with impossible to understand alien chronologies and scripts, is the history of the Mesoamerican. In place of Mesopotamia, the Mesoamerican connections to these stories that would create the religions that we know as the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Specifically, the real accounts, the real events, not the philosophies, not the doctrines, not the poetics, not the ontologies or the epistemologies, not the evangelios, not the logos of religions. That can happen anywhere. I'm talking about an actual map of what's described in detail in our version of the Old Testament, the conventional version of the Old Testament. As it's described, it has been inverted. It has been described as having it happened in the East, in the quote-unquote Old World. And America and the Western Hemisphere is described as the New World. It is actually the opposite. North America, South America, the Americas, is the biblical ancient land. That is the Old World, everything from the Garden of Eden to the coming of Christ. And as that age ended, with a return, or that age ends, basically in a version of our reality that is more normal appearing than we've had it since the entirety of history began. And by that I mean, now at this stage, as we end this era, North America looks geographically almost identical to the way it looks currently on any map. The forests, the fields, the lakes, the rivers, basically the coastline, all of it is where it is now. The peoples have positioned themselves to where they will be, and we approach modern day. The land is no longer oceanic or empty or filled with nomadic tribes. It has its permanent territorial residence. The tribes of the First Nations people, as we know them, have been established. The borders have been drawn. The lands have been filled. The Semitic peoples have returned either to Yosemite in the Utah area of the Western Pacific area, the Western Americas, the Rocky Mountains, and the Plains, or the southwestern deserts of the Mojave, of Nevada, of the Utah, of Arizona, and of northern Mexico and southern California. I mean, those people are the people of the 12 tribes of Israel. Those were the people who fled the Babylonian attack from central Mexico. They keep alive the serpent worship, while the people who returned to Yosemite have abandoned their serpent worship. They've abandoned their serpent worship and have evolved into worshiping eagles in defiance of their vision of the serpent, which led them astray and led them into bondage in Goshen for 400 years and forced them into the hardships of the Exodus and forced them into the lands of strangers, to a valley promised to them by God, to only once again fall into bondage from outsiders. These people rejected en masse any iconography of the serpent and chose instead the feathered eagle, who in their vision devoured the serpent, who in their remembrance embodied the virtues of the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl. In this version, it became the thunder bird. It became the lightning bird, the storm bird. And in this case is representative of the storm god, Baal. The storm god that these people worshipped across the plains and west coast of America. The people of the Southwest, the people of the Mojave, these raider tribes, these horseback warriors, they are true descendants of these Exodus people, of these Semitic Goshen slaves. They hold true to the vision of the serpent, but are forced into this exile of war in the desert. These Apache, these Navajo, these Comanche, and other warrior tribes oftentimes share iconography of serpents and swastikas painted on their horses. They are fearsome warriors known to take slaves and to kill without mercy. And then in central Mexico, current Mexico City, but back then Tenochtitlan, have the returned peoples local to the area once sojourned with these former Atlantean and Mu and priest classes, now warrior classes, now Native American classes across North America. And they return, but identify more with the ways of Babylon. This sets the stage for what we would know as Native American history. At the time, both before and immediately during the discovery of the New World, quote unquote, the New World, discovery of America by the Europeans, by the Spanish. And the next episode, I'll talk about how that begins the Fifth Age, where the former colonies of Atlantis that have evolved from the exiled cults of extremists that settled, extremists and outlaws that settled and forged their destinies in this hostile alien world of Europe, the Mediterranean, Middle East, and North Africa, into their own unique societies that we now know as European, as quote unquote the ancient world's other nations, Rome, the Celts, Gauls, the Germanic tribes, the Danes, the Greeks, the Romans, the Phoenicians, etc., etc., etc. That these people in their nation states, in their cults, in their churches, specifically the Vatican, specifically the Catholics, the catacomers, they would rise, they would crown their own messianic god king, a deified Caesar. And this Caesar, JC, Julius Caesar, would become the model for Alexander the Great, or first, would be the heir of the example of Alexander the Great, a great conqueror who was self-deified through his conquests. And following that model of deification of conquerors, Julius Caesar, upon conquering the rival colony of the Gauls and Celts, specifically the Gauls, would be emboldened enough to create a cult of his own based on his life example, known as the Caesar. And that Caesarship would morph into Christship, accumulating many of the mystical and occult beliefs of these colonies of Atlantis, the Phoenicians, the Mithraeans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Gauls, the Druids, creating a synthesis of former Atlantean values modeled into a church, a theocracy, a war machine that in its own efforts, simultaneously while this was occurring, would create the Holy Roman Empire that would literally appear from the east to the west as a great conqueror slash liberator of the West. And it would be that this example served as the background for much of the spiritual allegory, much of the literal example that would serve as the basis for Christ entering Jerusalem, dying and resurrecting and tearing down the temple that Solomon had built, tearing down the power structure, the society that had been built in the shadow of the Temple Mayor, a society that inherited the power, the authority that was once inspired by true divinity, and at this time had become a shadow of its former self, as well as inherited by imposters. And if you were listening to this broadcast and you listened back to the 4 previous broadcasts I have published, or the 3 previous episodes I published, this is the 4th one, you will see why the people who inherited at this point are imposters. They are not the